Okay, for this video, I wanted to go over the child tax credit in a bit more detail and specifically focus on the support test. So I've got some rules in front of us, some background on the credit itself and the support test, and then we've also got a sample worksheet here for determining support. So this worksheet is available on the IRS website and in various other publications, and it can be used to figure out whether or not you've met that support test for either a qualifying child for purposes of the child tax credit or even a qualifying relative. So you can use it for both. So we'll go through a sample fact pattern here and work through how the numbers are working out for the taxpayer. So a bit of background on the child tax credit. All right, so the 2022 amount, so these are returns that are filed in 2023, is $2,000 per child. And the child has to be under 17 years old. So in other words, the child has to be 16. If they turn 17 on the last day of the tax year, you're out of luck, right? Now that's different from the prior years. There was a reprieve where they increased the age by a year, and then the amount was also greater, right? So it was $3,000 or $3,600 per child, depending on their age. Now, the child tax credit, in order to be able to claim it, the child has to be a qualifying child, right? And so the child tax credit is found in Section 24 of the Internal Revenue Code. So 24C1 references the dependency sections, right? So it says the qualifying child means a qualifying child of the taxpayer as defined in 152C, right? And so obviously there's a lot of elements to be able to qualify, right? The age test, relationship test, residency, right? The child has to live with you for more than half of the year. It's got to be a U.S. citizen or U.S. resident, right? Not filing a joint return, claimed as a dependent. And then one of those elements of the many is the support test, right? So when we talk about the support test, 152C1D says that the child has not provided one half of their own support, right, for the calendar year. Now this is important because I think there's a lot of confusion about, well, the taxpayer has to be the one that's providing all this support, and that's not necessarily the case, right? It's just that the child, him or herself, cannot be the one that's providing more than one half of their own support. So you can have a child that is a taxpayer's qualifying child, right? So the taxpayer can claim them and claim that child tax credit, even though the taxpayer might not be the one providing more than one half the support, right? So how is support defined under the tax code? So if we look at Treasury Reg Section 1.152-1, so within there, it defines support as food, shelter, clothing, medical care, dental care, education, and other similar items, right? So the amount of a support item will be the amount of expense incurred by the one furnishing the item, right? So what is the dollar amount of the support that you purchase, right? Now, if the item of support furnished by an individual is in the form of property or lodging, you have to measure the amount of such item or support in terms of fair market value, right? So now, if you're providing something that's not necessarily maybe out of pocket directly, you got to figure out what the value of that support is and then allocate it to the child. So the IRS does have a worksheet on this, and that's where we're going to go through. So if you go to IRS Publication 501, this covers dependents, right? So that's the kind of the dependency publication. There is a worksheet 2, and that's what we're going to go through. So the worksheet is basically split up into 3 components. So at the top here, we talk about funds that belong to the potential qualifying child, right? So is the child working? Do they have other money that they have saved up from previous jobs, right? I mean, that's what we're after here. The second section is expenses for the whole household, right? So if you as a taxpayer are paying rent, utilities, other kind of expenses that apply to the household as a whole, you report all the expenses here and then allocate it amongst everybody that lives there, right? So that's kind of an indirect allocation to the qualifying child. And then the third section is those direct expenses for the child directly, right? So if you're buying clothes for the qualifying child, if you're paying for educational expenses, right? So those would be more appropriately put down here rather than up here because they don't apply to the whole household. Okay, so if we look at an example, let's say, for example, this qualifying child is 16, and so the child worked during the summer. They had a summer job, and they earned wages of $1,046, right? So minimum wage, just worked a few weeks during the summer, and so that was their total income that they earned, right? They earned that income working a summer job. On line 2, it asks us how much was used for their own support, right? So let's say that after they got their paychecks, they went and bought $350 worth of clothing, right? So the 16-year-old bought clothes for themselves, and so that came out of their savings. Line 3, amounts used for other purposes, not necessarily the support. The $80 there is just the taxes, right? So payroll taxes came out of their paycheck, so that was their gross wages. 7.65% is the $80, so that's why we have $80 there. And then so the amount of money that they'll have left over is the $616. And so it asks us here, add lines 2 through 4, and it should match line 1. So that reconciles, right? If they had total wages of $1,046, payroll taxes came out of $80, $350 they spent, they've got $616 left over. Now, the second section, this is filled out by the taxpayer that's going to claim the child as a qualifying child. And so the first item on the list here, lodging, right? And this is certainly one of the biggest expenses that anybody will incur, right? Your rent, your mortgage. And so in this example, our taxpayer spent $14,400 in rent during the year. Food for the whole family, right? $5,200. $1,500 on utilities. And so when you add up all these expenses, the total household expenses, line 11, $21,100. Now here on line 12, it's asking, how many persons are living in that household, right? Because again, remember, we're trying to figure out how to allocate indirect expenses to the qualifying child, the potential qualifying child, and then also account for this direct cost. So if it's mother and father and then one child in the house, there's 3, right? So we have 21,100 divided by 3 persons. And so that is the allocation to the qualifying child, right? $7,033 is 1/3 of the 21,000. So this is the qualifying child, right? The person's share of the household expenses. So this is the allocation of cost to that dependent. Now, again, remember, the section 3 here is those direct expenses in addition to the allocation, right? So enter the person's total clothing expenses. So if you, as the taxpayer that's going to claim this child as a qualifying child, $1,000 spent during the year on clothes, let's say, education expenses, right? So back to school supplies, $100. And so when we add up the total cost of the person's support for the year, we have $8,133. Now remember, the test for a qualifying child is they cannot have provided more than half of their own support. So when we look at 8,133 is the total support, and then down here in the last section, did this person provide more than half of his or her own support? 4,067 is half. And then on line 21, it asks us, enter the amount from line 2 plus the amount from line 6B if that person you supported owned the home. In this case, no, right? They rent a house, so the qualifying child doesn't own this home. So if we look back to line 2, right, line 2 up here, this is the amount, not the amount of income that the child had, right? It's the amount that they spent on their own support, right? Really, really important to remember that. The amount that they spent on their own support was $350 on clothes. So we have $350 they personally spent, and then there's the total support up there, $4,067. So it's asking us, right, is line 21 more than 20? No, right? So it's very clear in this situation that the child did not provide more than half of their own support. So you meet the support test for this person to be your qualifying child. Okay, and that's it. Now, it does say here, right, if you're not going for the qualifying child test here, but you're going for qualifying relative, right, to be able to claim as a dependent, then you would continue on to this section below, right? But in our case, no. We're doing this exercise to determine if the qualifying, if the child, the 16-year-old, can be a qualifying child for purposes of the child tax credit, and the answer is yes, right? So we've gone through the math here. It's clear that they didn't provide more than half their own support. Now, some might say that, well, it should be pretty obvious, right? You know it when you see it, whether or not the child provided more than half of their own support or not. And that is true, right? In a lot of cases, you don't have to go through this exercise, but there are situations, where you might have a 16-year-old that's, working on a full-time basis and is earning much more money. And then we look to the parent, and the parent perhaps is, unemployed, they're struggling to find work. You do have those family dynamics, and so that can create complications with this support test. All right, so that covers it. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment below. Happy to answer any I can. And I look forward to seeing you again on the next video. Thank you.